Mr. Burnham, I've got a few further questions. The first arises out of your observation in the course of today that the firmest of government lines have been established for a long time. Do you have any insight into or any thoughts about how it had come to be so set in stone, or how those lines had come to be so set in stone?
I mean, obviously, I was not in government in
No.
the 70s, 80s, or indeed a minister or in Parliament in the 90s. And I'm just going off, I guess, what I know about the way government thinks and works, but also what has been said about this issue. I do come back to the point that it's fear of the financial exposure, I think, that lies at the heart of this, possibly alongside protection of reputations of individuals and bodies and departments. But it just seemed that that was the course upon which the UK government set off. And I know there's the question of the destruction of Lord Owen's papers. I think if more were to be learnt about that, I don't know if it's possible to find out more about that. I think that may hold something of the answer. But all I can say is I used to get puzzled as an MP as to kind of, it was always about finance. And that's kind of, the MPs were left just asking for a bit more funding, a bit more help. And you know, the issue, it's that, you know, I got emotional earlier today when thinking about Paul Goggins, you know, great close friend of mine. But he was the only one I can recall who spoke about the people, listen to, you know, and that was never part of the consideration, and it's really bad, awful, terrible that's the way it was conducted. But it was all about the money.
In your last speech as an MP, you said that you would pass evidence to the police if the government failed to act. Obviously, as we know, the inquiry was set up. As a matter of fact, did you seek to pass evidence to the police?
I was absolutely ready to. And in many ways, I still am. I mean, I did say that if the inquiry was set up, I would not get in the way of an inquiry of this kind. I mean, it's very important that I didn't conflict or undermine this inquiry's work with it, you know, or delay it actually with a police inquiry. But I would have done that had it not been set up. I come back to Hazel Bullock and what I've come to know of the terrible thing that happened to her husband and his medical records. I personally believe straightforwardly that a criminal act has occurred in that case, and it would be for Hazel and her family to decide whether or not they would want to pursue that. I think her position has always been that she just wants the issue to be understood and resolved for everybody, and I hope that is what now happens. But I've not said anything I've said. I've not said lightly. I've thought about it carefully, and you know, I would reserve the right at some point to still do that, because you know, I can't see how withholding a diagnosis from a patient can possibly be anything other than, well, is it criminal? I think it is, because of the impact that can have on people. I've made mention today about the CPS and corporate manslaughter. Again, there is, in my view, a very clear case to be made for that, in the failure to deliver on self-sufficiency when it was known that British people would be at risk if there wasn't self-sufficiency, carrying on using products imported with all of the risks without telling people, even though that was way after the issue had been acknowledged, and then into the 2000s, leaving people in physical and emotional and financial distress who were already very damaged. That too is an act of gross negligence and is evidence of paying scant regard to people's needs, which so I understand it is the test. All of that is relevant, I think, and those avenues should remain open. But I would not in any way want to divert this inquiry, cut across this inquiry. You know, I hope it will deliver what people, I hope it just will deliver the truth and the justice that people deserve. So I hope that answers the question.
With witnesses over the last few weeks, there have been discussions of the idea of corporate memory, of the problems that ministers come and go, often quite quickly.
They do.
Civil servants come and go, usually over a longer period of time, but nonetheless, they come and go. Are there mechanisms that could try and, that you can think of, that would ensure that history doesn't get rewritten,
Yeah.
and that things that happened are retained within the knowledge of the department and passed on to successive ministers or civil servants?
Well, I'm glad you're asking these questions, and I would be so pleased to see some potential remedies coming forward from this inquiry, because I think they are needed. I've made reference today to sort of wider issues of injustice, which suggest a similar culture in other government departments. But let's just for a moment talk about the Department for Health, because it's not just infected blood that's an ongoing issue that hasn't been resolved so far on. You could think of Primados, which was a pregnancy drug test. You could think of sodium valproate. You could think of mesh, the mesh that was inserted with devastating consequences. There's actually quite a lot of similar issues in that same territory that are unresolved issues involving the pharmaceutical industry, or the devices, the medical products industry. So there's a bigger hinterland here than just infected blood, although infected blood is by far the biggest. Surely there needs to be a framework for how these issues should be handled, to establish the truth, as I was saying before, at the first opportunity, and then mechanisms for appropriate redress for people who have been wronged. So it would be something in that space, to be honest, and potentially the Cabinet Office, rather than the department that's got the issue, an independent function within government where complaints can be lodged about a particular issue. It's very significant, though, the fact that there are so many unresolved injustices, and particularly in the field of health. This is lives ruined, many lives ruined. It's clear that the way we've run the country in those decades has not delivered fairness or justice for those people. Something better is definitely needed.
When there are investigations and inquiries that result in recommendations, as you've alluded to, those recommendations or reports do not always get implemented or sometimes even responded to. And you gave the example of Bishop Jones's report in particular. Would you support some kind of mechanism, an inquiries commissioner or whatever you might want to call it, someone whose role it is to follow up how government seeks to learn lessons or doesn't seek to learn lessons, follows up when inquiries or investigations make recommendations, issue reports, to see whether those are implemented and responded to?
I think that's an excellent suggestion, and it very much complements the notion of a public advocate that I mentioned before. And perhaps those two roles could be combined within a independent function in the Cabinet Office, or to be discussed. I guess the overall remedy, though, is what I would point you to. We call it the Hillsborough Law, but it's a consolidation of some of these measures. What you've got to do at the end of the day is empower the individual against sometimes the might of the state. The state holds all the power, all the cards, and it leaves people fighting away in the wilderness often, without the means to get the justice that they need. So the duty of candor on public servants, the parity of legal funding at inquests where the state is involved, the public advocate measure that I've mentioned, the Hillsborough Law, which is a consolidation of all of these measures, actually implementing the recommendations of Bishop James Jones' report, alongside what you've just said around an inquiries commissioner, a public advocate. I think you're getting towards a rebalancing of the system in favour of ordinary people, if you like, and away from the system.
And just picking up on the duty of candor that would emerge from the Hillsborough Law, is there a danger with the duty of candor that it might drive decision-making, note-taking and records into personal notebooks and disposable records, or result in things not being recorded at all? And if so, how might that be addressed?
So it would be a duty that applies to inquiries, if you like, either localised inquiries set up by a council, internal inquiries set up by a particular body. It wouldn't be about every single day having to be, what do I need to tell the truth about today? It'd just be about when there is a process of inquiry that there is a legal requirement that you tell everything you know. In the same way as I took the oath today, it's that, isn't it? If in that situation you must say everything you know. Now, I wouldn't want to go into the details today, it wouldn't be appropriate, but I set up, just to illustrate what I'm saying, I set up a voluntary inquiry, you could call it maybe similar to the Archer review, following the Manchester Arena bombing. It was chaired by Lord Kerslake, a very kind of senior figure known to many people in this room, I'm sure. There was and there is a concern amongst one of the bereaved families from that appalling attack in the heart of our city that our police force did not give a wholly accurate account to that inquiry and gave a different account when people were under oath. Now, that's not acceptable. People should be telling the truth at the first time of asking. So the duty of candor applies when you're asked, what was your view of this incident? What happened? It's about being wholly truthful at that moment. And I don't believe that should have an effect of driving. People should go about their normal job, but when asked to give an account, they should be under a duty to do so and know that they can't be demoted or done down or sacked for doing so.
Would you support a duty to keep records and and be accurate and to check the information that's recorded in government documents?
Yes, I would. I mean, I think there's something, well, there's certainly a duty that should apply to government departments. And I do think we need to know more, don't we, about how can a government department lose papers from a big chunk of time on an issue that we knew was clearly a controversial issue, even then in the 70s. I don't see how that's possible. There should be a framework, shouldn't there, for record keeping. But I think it needs to go further than government, because I've made reference today to the handling of medical records, records held at the local level, and I don't know, if the inquiry is going to go into this stage, but I would hope it would, as to understand, well, how did that happen in so many multiple cases that records were lost, deleted, withheld? I mean, I don't know whether your point about records needs to extend to the kind of question of records held at local level as well as national level, because it's often the putting together of both things that tells the whole story about something that may have gone wrong.
And then going back to the Department of Health, do you know whether there was, as it were, a library, a file of lines to take?
On this issue?
on this issue, or whether it's something you came across on other issues?
Well, there always would be lines to take. And I know that can sound a bit sinister, but it shouldn't necessarily be considered in that way, because, often ministers would be asked to comment on something that was outside of their direct portfolio. So they would need a sense of what the position was. And of course, any minister, with the agreement of the Secretary of State, is able at any time actually to change those lines to take. And I have indicated today how that process happens. It's hard, but you can do it. So I think the risk here is, those lines to take becoming so sort of embedded in the system. I think you also maybe need to think about, well, how lines to take can never, you've always got to be conscious that it might change and perspectives will change. The process that I described about the treat official process is something that I think you should think about, because how can lines to take change if ministers are not seeing what people are saying and how they're reacting to those lines to take, and challenging them if they're not coming up to ministers because they're just going in and they're coming back out again. So people are challenging the lines to take and then they're sending the lines to take back out. I think that is something that is a real issue. And I do think other ministers who've been in the Department of Health have made a similar point to me as that.
And would it be a good idea if you've got lines to take, particularly on a not a fast-moving contemporaneous issue, but on an issue that may be rooted in previous administrations? Would it be a good idea for each such line to take to have a file of documents associated with it that evidences or sets out the justification for that line, so that the minister could, rather than just simply being faced with the line to take, could say, well, can I see what that's based on? And then could have a look and ask questions that doesn't quite add up.
I think so. I mean, ministers can do that. You are always able to say to officials, you've got that in the note, can I? But it's probably the odd time that a minister would do that. And a kind of more, a more balanced presentation of issues absolutely should be always what is put before ministers. I think you'd find it hard to consider what you've shown me today was going to be conducive to balanced decision making. It was one-sided in terms of its presentation of issues, and I do think I actually feel there does need to be quite a response from government to this inquiry, from what I know has already come out, because it says something about how we're all governed and how hard it is to correct injustice in this country. It's too hard. The scales are too weighed against ordinary people fighting when wrongs have been done. There does need to be a sort of levelling up of those. Levelling up is a phrase that we usually says, well, how about level up those scales of justice so that it's not as hard as it is. The fight takes too much out of people. I think it's incredible that people are still, as they're doing, kind of fighting the fight for loved ones, for people they know. But they shouldn't, and I've met so many thousands of people that are just kind of left in this, in this place, and it's happened to too many people. And nuclear test veterans is one. You're please, I hope I'm not going beyond what I should be saying, Chair, and saying that please do think how your recommendations could help another campaign where I am certain there is another injustice of major proportions. What you might say could actually help them, because things are not in the right kind of order at the moment. There is too tight a control of the information and the lines and something needs to happen to change that grip of issues by the vested interest that might have most to lose by the exposure of that issue.
And then can I just pick up on one final point? We heard from an earlier minister. In my mind, it's Lord Waldegrave, but it might be someone else. It might have been someone else. But in any event, when asked about the extent to which ministers might be able to go to Parliament and be more open about things having been done wrong, decisions having been made that should now be reversed. Part of the answer that whoever it was gave was to say that's actually quite a difficult process, because immediately the call from the opposition will be not necessarily the most receptive one. It'll just be almost a blaming exercise. You referred earlier to the processes within Parliament and the extent to which that can or cannot be conducive to the best kind of decision making. In relation to the issue I've just put, are there ways in which it could be made easier for ministers to say we got things wrong?
I think so. I don't think the public punish people for getting things wrong. I think they will always punish people much more for covering up when something has gone wrong. That is actually the greater offence, I think, in the eyes of the public. And I think ministers, part of the kind of culture of Whitehall should be about a learning environment. They keep saying learn the lessons. How many times, I said before, do we hear that phrase? But they don't, because they don't open up on things. So I do think we've hit a point here. You know, as I say, it's staggering that we're in this room today, that, you know, almost 5 decades on from when these issues first arose. You know, that itself says something, doesn't it? That is, something is amiss at the heart of the system. I just think there has to be a different way of thinking about these things. And in the civil service training, that duty of candor should, you know, that shouldn't just be about individual. Well, it will be about individuals, but I'm talking about a culture change that should come from that. It's actually about protecting ministers, to be honest. What happens, I think ministers get put at risk quite severely by the system that we've got, because you're sitting on top of a system, and I would understand it, and I know some of the campaigners will feel this, that you're knowledgeable about all this stuff that's going on underneath you, the treat official, that's more dangerous, to be honest with you, than ministers saying, oh no, I've had a report now, this wasn't, you know. The bigger risk politically to people is it looking like you're sitting atop a sort of an unresponsive system that's batting people away, pulling the shutters down. That in the end will somebody will be in the position when that breaks out, and then the political consequences will be harder for that individual and the government of the day. So it's a cultural change that's needed. I can only say that, you know, in my time in Parliament, Hillsborough changed when Theresa May and I started, you know, with other people as well, but that cross-party connection was made. On this issue, I referred to it before, I could barely name an MP who didn't try and represent their constituents on infected blood, but they could not break through. You know, Parliament was, the balance between the civil service and Parliament was wrong here. Parliament couldn't break the door open on this issue. And it was only that, I'm not over-claiming for my role, but it was only when, you know, the police were mentioned and that seemed to change. So there is the need for something fundamentally different than the way we're doing things. And I think the remedies that you've suggested today all sound like they have merit to me, but I would say it's not just internal changes. You have to empower the public to challenge people more effectively. And the Hillsborough Law, I think, is something that it's called that, but it's obviously it's a name that we put on it. But let me put it this way: the recommendations of Bishop James Jones should not be going nowhere for 5 years. When a Prime Minister asked somebody of his stature to look into what's gone wrong, it's reflective of the same culture that it is sitting there for 5 years. So maybe this inquiry can break that impasse.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from the core participant suggestions. I'm just going to check with Ms Gray. No questions from Ms Gray. But before we ask Mr Burnham if there's anything he wishes to add, do you have any questions, sir?
Yes. The Hillsborough Law, the Public Authority Accountability Bill, I think is its full title, as published, it creates a duty of candour in particular, as you say, but not exclusively, when dealing with court proceedings, official inquiries and investigations. And in other circumstances where a public authority, public servant or official acts in a private law matter or non-public function, the duties apply except where to do so might significantly and disproportionately damage the public interest. So those are the duties. Now, the question arises, how do those duties actually be observed? And the answer that is given by the Act is it that there is a danger of creating a criminal offence if what is done intentionally or recklessly?
Yes, that's right, Sir Brian. The Act is, I think, trying to set a lower bar than perhaps you would find with misconduct in public office. It would be implemented corporately on the entity, the body, the public body, but contractually as well in the individual contracts of public servants, and it obviously would be an offence not, as I said, not in just replying to an email to a colleague. We are talking about official inquiries, as you said. So to give partial or worse, an inaccurate account to an inquiry set up by a recognised body, a council, a body like the one I lead, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, that would be a very serious offence.
Ms Richards, in her questions to the end from core participants, asked the question whether the existence of this duty, enforced as it is by criminal sanction, might lead people not to record things, if you like, defensive action, rather than record them just in case it later proves to be wrong. There's a further danger, possibly, that an official in the department comes to a received line which has been parroted out before, and thinks to themselves, well, if I try to check this, I may discover it's wrong, and I may be, therefore, acting properly, but I could, on the other hand, get myself into trouble if I don't look carefully enough, so I won't look at all. I'll just simply repeat the line. And they're not acting intentionally, telling a falsehood. They're not acting recklessly, probably, in not being candid, even though you could say they're a bit careless in not going back and checking. So, again, it could be that the sanction approach isn't the only approach. You would, from your time in the health ministry, no doubt think that prevention is better than cure.
I would.
And using another aphorism, carrot and stick. The two ways of enforcing behaviour, one is stick, the other is carrot.
I think they're related, though, aren't they? The existence of the stick as a backdrop, because it's there that sits behind things should things go wrong. What it is seeking to do is create the preventative climate in the body, isn't it? That you're supported to come forward. We want you to come forward. And I thought I would find it very odd if a duty of candour led to people, ooh, I'm now under a duty of candour, therefore I won't put things in mine, I won't record. You would do the opposite, surely. Most people would. Well, I wasn't happy with that today. I'm just going to, I'll just take a note of it. You would think it would create the opposite culture. I mean, all I can say is I feel the culture isn't right, at the moment. The tendency to pull the shutters down, to push the public away when things go wrong, is clear. I think there must be a better way, and I think it's often the fear of being done down, loss of promotion. Often it's harder to speak up in an organisation for all of those reasons, and hence the norm is what that, isn't it? That we don't have often a culture of where people feel empowered to point out when things are wrong, and we need to learn lessons. Needs to mean what it says, i.e., a learning culture, and not a punitive culture. When people point out a concern about something that wasn't right. So, I think the duty of candor is a simple idea. Tell the truth at the first time of asking. I personally don't see what is problematic about that if people are doing what they should do, which is serving the public first and foremost.
You in this inquiry, we've heard quite a lot of cases of people being told by their doctors that things aren't nearly as bad as they might think, that the press is being sensationalist, that the illness they've got won't cause them any problems at all, which in most cases was not the fact. And there is some evidence that the doctors knew or ought to have known better. Now, how do you enforce their duty? Because it's the same interpersonal obligation on a very personal level to tell the truth, the whole truth, which may not be easy to listen to a patient when you'd far rather be delivering good news to the patient.
I think those are matters of professional regulation with regard to the GMC or other medical regulatory bodies. I think this is an area where there has to be clarity. I don't see how it can be justified that a clinician can be aware of a diagnosis, a test that has revealed an infection, and not communicate that. The damage is greater in the not, is it not, Chair, than in the difficult news. The difficult news is what you need to hear if you are hepatitis C positive, HIV, or any other infection. And I think medical regulatory bodies would do require that now. The duty of candor would imply to an inquiry, a bigger process set up. I think it's important to make that distinction. I do think Sir Robert's duty of candor, as I'm told, has had some beneficial impact on speeding up the settlement of medical negligence claims and possibly saved time and resource going into the fighting of claims. I'm putting forward that there is a case for a much broader duty of candor to get the transparency as a culture that exists around Whitehall. It doesn't exist at the moment, and that absolutely is something that I'm determined to change.
The history of the NHS over the last 50, 60 years has involved there being quite a number of inquiries. Now, they may be a little different from this inquiry, because this inquiry takes a very broad, systemic look at the whole system, going right to the department and the politicians at the top. But in each case, or almost each case that I know of, there has been a call in the inquiry report for a change of culture.
Yeah.
And in each successive case, it would appear that that change of culture hasn't really happened. Which is why I ask about the carrot as well as the stick. Because the stick, in terms of penalising bad behaviour, is there to some extent in the GMC. It's there to some extent in the ability of people, if they have sufficient resource and will, to take legal action if there is sufficient to show that there may be a case. But how do we create a culture in which, rather than being defensive, people value candor? Is your act part of it? Is there something else we can do to avoid any, if I were to suggest, for instance, a change of culture is needed, that reaching the same fate as those who have said there should be a duty of candor before?
I think the carrot is letting people do their job and answer their calling. Most public servants that I've dealt with, and I've been at pains today at points in my evidence to say how much respect I have for the civil servants that I worked with, and I do now in terms of the people who work in Greater Manchester Police or other Greater Manchester entities. They want to serve the public. It's why they do what they do, but they are often working in organisations that make them feel they can't or they have to pull back. So the carrot is empower people to do their job and do what they feel is right, and don't send them home feeling, oh, should I have said something about? I think that's the duty of, the effect of a duty of candour. It's just that it frees people up to serve the public and do what they feel to be right without the fear of reprisal. Because as you say, many reports have talked about the need for culture change, but it hasn't been achieved. I'm prepared to accept there might be another mechanism to improve culture, but I can't think of it. And I do think Sir Robert's duty of candour has had some impact on the NHS, is what I'm told, and that's a good thing. So why not build from there and see if we can apply it more broadly?
If the supervisor places a value upon a particular characteristic of people at work, and we know that in general terms it happens if there's somebody who's a hard worker, that's valuing hard work or productivity. If part of the value is being candid and checking your facts, that may place a value on them, which may create a carrot, or might it? Would it work?
I think so. It's somebody doing their, not becoming a problem or awkward, as sometimes they can be categorised, but doing their job and fulfilling the obligation that the organisation is being judged by, because the duty of candour would apply corporately as well as individually. So anybody who fulfilled their individual duty would be kind of serving the wider aim. I think we have to be honest about where this is coming from. You know, this is about seniors in the South Yorkshire Police telling people to rewrite the statements of individual officers. Those officers, actually, if you go back to those police statements, were very candid, honest. Some of them were quite emotionally challenging to read because they were so upset about what they'd seen. But then they had all of that taken out. And that is what this duty is doing. It's often people who are working on the front line who want to be honest about things and what they've seen. And in this case, I think the same, I guess. People would want, there will be people in the system always who want to do the right thing. And it's about empowering people who want to do the right thing and undermining people who want to do the wrong thing. At the moment, it's too easy for those who want to do the wrong thing to assert their culture in an organisation. And somehow you've got to turn that around. So I was very pleased when Bishop James did his report. I mean, the title says it all, the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. You know, that's, I mean, no one in this room needs any lessons about that, because they've lived with that for decades. So something different is needed here. And I think the duty, although it's, it's framed as a stick measure, it could actually be an empowering, preventative measure if it's implemented properly.
Might there be an element of carrot if, following on from your remarks, the duty is seen as a management responsibility to encourage, upon which the management will be held accountable?
Yes, I think there may be ways of measuring the effect it might have on morale, on productivity. How much energy is consumed by the attempt to fight people who've been wronged? Public bodies are spending thousands of pounds of our money on lawyers, and nothing wrong with lawyers, but they are spending thousands of pounds of our money fighting these things, for no public benefit, zero public benefit. For institutional benefit, perhaps, but is that a public benefit if they manage to sort of grind people into the ground because they've spent so much on legal costs? It's not that's the point, I think. This is actually wasteful of public resources. A duty of candor might reduce the costs that are being spent fighting cases, fighting the public. I believe it could. Margaret Aspinall, chair of the Hillsborough Family Support Group, says it very bluntly, please just tell us the truth at the first opportunity. The difference that would have made to us is incalculable. You can't put a value on it, actually. And I think that call is magnified in terms of the people in this room, the people watching who've suffered as a result of this issue. It's unclear to me, and I don't know, Sir Brian, whether you can get any closer to this, but how could there be such widespread withholding of diagnoses, with widespread kind of withholding of people's medical records, widespread deletion of chunks of people's medical records, or in the case of the manipulation of medical records where a key piece was suddenly removed from a file when she saw it, which was something I spoke about in Parliament. If you think about it in the context of this inquiry and a duty of candor, who could such widespread behaviour of the kind I've just described, what prompted it? Did everyone individually in those places do it off their own bat? Was there something more than that? I honestly don't know, but I know there's so many examples of it in this instance that says the lack of a duty of candor is highly problematic in terms of the type of behaviour that was going on. It would have taken one person in the medical records department of a hospital to say, I was asked to delete this from this file, or I was asked to withhold this file, or I was asked to fight the release of this file in a court, and you know what? I'm going public about that because I'm not prepared to do it. It's not in the it's not right. It's not in the public. Do you see the point I'm making? I think that is the benefit of it, and it will allow those bad behaviours and cultures to take root in, not just in organisations, but even in parts of organisations. It's clear to me that there was systematic covering up of information in this case, and I can't think of a better remedy than a duty of candor. If there is one, I would probably support. If there is a better remedy, I would support that too. But what I do know is we have an event in Parliament next week to, if you like, launch the consolidated Hillsborough Law, and I would say that people need to start feeding into the. You could read out bits of my bill that maybe need to be improved, but people of your stature need to start improving this legislation so that we do rebalance the system in the favour of the people in this room, the people watching, the people wronged by this scandal.
Thank you very much. That's all I ask.
Mr. Burnham, is there anything you would like to add?
I think I've probably said what I needed to say today, so I won't detain the inquiry much longer. I've said everything today after great thought, and I just need to say that again. After great thought, I've been on a journey really in terms of my understanding of the way this country works ever since I was invited to the 20th anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster. That was, if you like, my fork in the road. I was a loyal minister until I was doing my bit, and I was the team player, and I was reading the lines to take, and then I was confronted with a situation where the government I was in was clearly not listening to the people I'd grown up with, and I had to decide what was I going to do, and that is what happened to me on the 20th anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster. And obviously I kind of chose the path of saying, well, things are not, I can't justify this because I know they're right, I know the government's wrong. So then I obviously challenged. And that then took me into the Department of Health. And, I would say to everybody listening, I would like to say sorry to everybody for being too slow to act. I wish I'd done things sooner. I do. I really do. But you can only act on what you know at the time, can't you? And you can only change things where you can actually get hold of the evidence that you need. But that was where I began to change my thinking about how things work and how things, or shall I put it the other way, how things don't work for people. And so I took that thinking into the year I was in the Department of Health, and then through and to this inquiry today. This is the product of a lot of thought. And if the measures I propose aren't right, well, I would say, let's get this right so that we don't let anyone who has followed this, we don't let these things carry on happening to people in this position. It's so important. This is about how we've been governed, and it's not good enough for people who are most harmed. So, as I say, I'm conscious today of the enormity of the issues that are involved here, but mainly everything I've said today is born out of a consciousness of the many thousands of people, lives ruined, families devastated, the level of harm caused by people being left in the wilderness for all of these decades. I know I've spoken of the haemophilia community a lot today because they're the people I have got to know. But I know people have been infected in other circumstances, people with other conditions, or people infected via blood transfusions. I know there's a whole range of ways in which people, for no fault of their own, have found themselves in this position. So, as I say to everyone in this room and watching, I would just like to say sorry that I didn't do more. But we are here today, not because of anything that I've done or any politician did, but it was because that you never gave up. So thank you very much, Chair.
Can I add my thanks to the very obvious thanks of those in the room, in particular for your candour in the way in which you've told us your account and you've given your evidence.
I have placed myself under the same duty that I've been calling for today.
Well, it seems to me, as far as I can tell, that you have fully observed it, so thank you.
So we resume on Monday with presentations in relation to decision-making in Northern Ireland and Wales, and then we have witnesses for the remainder of next week.
Yes, so Monday, 10 o'clock.